Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth episode of our monthly live virtual series called Beyond the Clinic, Living with Melanoma. I'm Dr. Raymond Liu, practicing oncologist and director of the Cancer Survivorship Program at Kaiser Permanente, San Francisco. In 30 minutes each month, we'll explore topics designed to support you and your family's needs. I'll be monitoring the chat during our conversation. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A session, and we'll try to address as many issues as we can in our next 30 minutes together. I like to always start with an acknowledgement to our patients and others on the call today. As if communicating well with our families while dealing with melanoma wasn't hard enough, remote schooling and changes in our support network during the pandemic are adding a whole new dimension to things, and we'll try to unpack some of the thorny issues today. It's an honor to introduce my guest, Dr. Paula Rauch, Timothy Christopher Chair of Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital, and the founding director of the Marjorie E. Korff Parenting At a Challenging Time program. Dr. Rauch, welcome to the program. It's such an honor to have you on today.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here with you.
Great. So I've read your book, Raising an Emotionally Healthy Child, and it's packed with some really great content. And maybe we could start talking about the book in the sense that you mentioned understanding stages of child development is critical to knowing how to communicate well with them. So let's talk child development.
I would love to talk to child development. So any experience that happens to a child is going to see it through the lens of of whatever phase of development they're in. And as they get through that phase, they may need to revisit, and families may need to revisit what a child's experience has been, even of the same event. So when I'm meeting with families in the Massachusetts General Hospital Cancer Center, where I work with families, I start my consultations by saying, tell me about your children. How old are they? Give me a little feel of what their temperament is like, because temperament matters too. Any of us, I know you have more than one child, I have more than one child. Any of us with more than one child know that our children aren't identical to each other. They kind of come wired with a little bit of a personality. One might be shy, one might be outgoing. And so that also helps us to understand what is that lens that they're looking through as they're experiencing their world. And what we try to do under the unique and challenging circumstances of a parent's melanoma or other cancer is to make sure that all the things that support child resilience at any time are in place, but some specific things that respect the particular challenges of cancer care also are front of mind. When I'm meeting with someone who has a child who's under 3, I want to be sure that they know that a child under 3 will thrive with good caretakers. It doesn't have to be a parent. It has to be someone attuned that gets to know a child's nonverbals, that kids of all ages, but especially younger kids, thrive on structure and consistency. So having a sense of what's coming next, especially at times of uncertainty, probably for us as adults too, it's nice to know what's coming next. It makes you feel like things aren't as disrupted or scary. What that looks like for a child under 3, having regular sleep times, having a consistent set of meals or caregivers that read their nonverbal cues, what it might need for a preschooler is a ritual at bedtime, bath 2 books, and I'll tuck you into bed, and reminding the multiple caregivers that as much as, 4-year-old Doug says, I need 6 books or 9 books, that actually he'll do
12,
better.
or keep going.
12, 15, and he'll do better staying with that structure and consistency and knowing what comes next.
Right. I mean, it was just so amazing that when I read the book, you were talking about child development. I've read some parenting books, and it really felt like a lot of the things were related to child, like what a child could understand at that age. And you mentioned sort of toddlers and talking about how they like to split one parent versus the other, and that's a common thing. And then how do you throw in then the cancer diagnosis with it? I think that is really where, how do we get to that level of communication with our kids? What do you think?
So I'm going to take it one step further and say, one of the things that I've learned from about 25 years of doing this work is that 90% or more of what parents see is normal development. The content what they may be splitting their parents about. It's a wonderful life skill to be figuring out as a junior sociologist or anthropologist, which parent do I go to if I want those more books? Who's going to be likely to let me walk around with my food as opposed to sit in my high chair? Who's going to take me outside, even if it's freezing cold? We're here in the Northeast where that's an issue. So learning which parent is likely to say yes or no to what is a wonderful life skill. Things get more painful from a parent's perspective when the natural, normal task of being a young child, which is to convince your parents that everything you want is something you absolutely need. But when a parent is in treatment, for example, and has been really fatigued and is having a good day and really wants to be the one to do the bedtime ritual with the child, and they say, no, I want the other parent, it feels different. And it can be helpful to remember that in other homes where there isn't a parent with cancer, that the kids are doing the same thing. If mom is available to do bedtime reading, I want dad. And if dad is available to do bedtime reading, I want dad. Or maybe I just want to be able to say, I get to choose. And I'm always going to get to choose, because that's part of what older toddlers and younger preschoolers are learning, and maybe what we learn all of our lives. Is it true that the people who love us give us enough of what we need when we need it, but maybe not everything we want when we want it?
Right. And I think from what you were saying too, is as parents too, if we're tired, and because I deal this with in my household, if you're tired, it's okay. It's okay. So there has to be also some self-forgiveness about that, because you're interacting with the child, but at the same time, you have to also forgive yourself if you're tired or you're in pain, or if there's something going on with yourself physically.
Absolutely. And I think being able to talk about it is wonderful modeling for a child. Our kids are learning all the time, and they are learning from us. Sometimes I say to a parent, if your child was the parent, what would you want them to do? And many parents are much more forgiving of their child. They would say, oh, I would want my child to get extra sleep if they were the parent. I would want this and this and this. And then I say to them, well, can you show yourself the same compassion that you showed to your child? And sometimes that's not easy. But for a parent to say, I'm tired or I'm grumpy, that's actually wonderful modeling for children. Give me a minute. I need to have a quiet moment, and then I'll be able to engage this way. Or this is a night when I'm tired and it's going to be daddy's turn. Or this is a night when I'm tired, it's going to be mommy's turn.
Right.
Making it talk aboutable. I know it's not a real word, but it's one that should be a real word, and one that I use often, because some of the hardest things, in order to help to include a child and help a child to build the skills to adjust to obstacles, challenges, uncertainty, changes, come from making it talk aboutable. Then the child and the parent can share in understanding something together, and that is enormously helpful for resilience.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also realize that, because I have a child also going to adolescence, and adolescents, they look much more mature, but emotionally they may not, and that's something you talk about in the book as well. And that's very interesting, because you assume, okay, they're adult, they look like an adult, but inside they're processing it differently, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I joke that up through about age 11, children are more like golden retrievers. Like, they're so enthusiastic and they love your attention and they want your praise. And then suddenly, inexplicably, as they enter middle school, they turn into Siamese cats, and they kind of will be interested in you on their time schedule, and they're like, oh yeah, I did well on that, or yeah, I scored that goal. It's no big deal. So the tone of it can really change as they enter adolescence. And we know that adolescent brains are actually different. When an adult is talking, an adolescent hears yelling, and that's particularly true for authorities. And many parents will smile when I say this because they've had the experience where they feel like they're talking to their child and their child says, stop yelling, or with all the capacity for thinking that adolescents have, not necessarily stepping up to the plate to do what a parent thinks ought to get done, but more abstract thinking. There'll be a whole conversation that the teenager has already had. And one of the ones, my youngest child's 32 now, but I remember the conversations with the kids when they were teenagers that would start with, I know what you're going to say. And I would say, I don't even know what we're talking about yet. I'm glad you know what I'm going to say, but like, I don't know. But it's because they can do that processing. And along with that process of new abstract thinking, hormones, a much more amped up brain, frequently parents feel like even when they're teenagers seem to understand logically what needs to happen, it's eclipsed by their emotional experience. And parents will say, oh, he said he was going to help, but then he's on the computer and I need him to take out the garbage. And I go take out the garbage. And the teen says, I'm in the middle of doing something. My mom says, take out the garbage. And she says it again every 1 to 2 minutes. And then she gets mad and she takes it out herself. And the mom says, I asked him to do almost nothing and just to take out the garbage.
Well, I think you're just describing my household here too, but so it's interesting too, because I didn't realize that. And so I'm also wondering, like, if there's actually a raised voice, what that would be interpreted as from an adolescent. But so I think communication could be different depending on development, but I think you're also really in your book talk a lot about how, like, finding moments to communicate. So finding that calm moment, and I wanted to sort of visit that a little bit. So how things are so hectic right now, where do we find the time, and when is the right time to have a communication about things?
So one of the wonderful things about doing parent guidance is that parents know their kids so well, and they can pretty quickly, in my experience, and I'm guessing most of you on the line now, you know where the places are where your child is likely to have a kind of more reflective conversation. It's frequently in the car when you're driving and your child is looking out the window. It may be when you're at the sink or the stove, again, when your child's not looking face to face with you. For younger kids, it might be bedtime, it might be bath time, it might be walking the dog. Any of those, and you'll hear a lot of them are side by side, not face to face times, because kids emotionally reference off us as adults means they see our face and they feel it intensely. Sometimes when there are hard things to talk about, they don't want to see our face. So not only do you want to think about prioritizing those talking times in the evening during the commercials of a favorite TV show, if people even watch TV with commercials anymore, but as opposed to streaming, but really prioritizing those times when conversations may happen, and remembering that important conversations are not a one and done thing. They're a multiple pieces of conversation. And with teenagers, back to the idea of how loud the emotion is, sometimes texting is great. Chores are great when they're in a list. Please take out the garbage by 8 o'clock.
Text. Send.
Yeah, or literally texting bits of information. And then there may be a follow-up conversation. But be creative about the ways that work. Parents know their kids well.
That's a great point. We have a great Facebook question here, which is, the question is about how to talk about a cancer diagnosis with a child of 7 years old, and in this case, it's a 20-year-old sister who has melanoma. So this makes it even more complicated because it's not the parent that has the condition, but it's a sibling. So now you're not only dealing with 2 levels of development, but it's also a sibling. So how do we talk about that?
So I think the first is to talk with the 20-year-old and help that 20-year-old to understand why it's important to talk to the 7-year-old. And then generally what we say to young kids is that our bodies are made up of many, 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 many teeny weeny cells that are like Legos that are too small to see in a microscope. And cancer cells are mixed up Legos that don't fit together right and can't do their job. And they get in the way of the healthy cells. And melanoma cells are those mixed up cancer cells that are on your skin, and they can make themselves and get in the way of healthy cells. And then that's usually a pretty good start of explaining what cancer is. Then we often are wondering together, where may a child of age 6 and up, maybe even younger, where might they have heard about cancer before? So if there's been somebody else in the family, each cancer story is different. We want to be sure to help children of any age to understand that one person's cancer story, somebody in the family, somebody in the neighborhood, somebody at school, is not the same as, in this case, a sibling's cancer story, because we want them to keep coming back to us as adults to get accurate information.
So what I'm hearing here is, again, sort of like, know your kids, like think about who they are, to customize the message, use analogies. Certainly the Lego analogy is Lego's popular, so using things that they could relate to help explain things. That's amazing. We have another question here, which is it appropriate to tell my kids I have melanoma? And if so, how do I share the diagnosis? And I was struck by something you had written about, because this is something I dealt with illness in my family, which is whether we should be open about it, and is it better to be open? When is the right time to talk about it? So what are your thoughts?
So I'm a proponent of telling kids early, when there's not necessarily anything changing, or as early as one is able to, because that allows the most time to co-process and to share information. Most of us, but certainly kids, cope least well when we're shocked by things. So often when parents think they're protecting their child by not talking about something that's scary or upsetting, the child feels excluded. And sometimes a parent will say to me, I don't want to tell my child because they'll be upset. And then I'll say, well, they should be upset because it's not good news. But the process of dealing with something together that's upsetting and sharing it demonstrates that as a family, it's a family value to talk about hard stuff together. And in fact, we would want our teenagers to tell us things that we didn't want to hear. Even if at the moment we don't want to hear it, in order to keep a teenager safe, they need to share hard truths with us about what's going on at those parties that we might not be happy about. Who's in the car? All of those things. And so modeling that we are able to talk about things that are upsetting. Kids tend to re-regulate to feeling they may get news and be distressed. More times than not, parents are surprised at how well their children take in the information, especially if there's not something happening emergently at the moment. And then letting a child know, this is what we know now. This is the treatment that my medical team is providing. I have confidence in my medical team. And if things change, because they're going to be following me, if I get new news, I'll share it. But right now, the goal of my treatment is to get rid of all the cancer cells, or the goal of my treatment is to keep the cancer in as few places as possible, or the goal of my treatment is for me to have as little discomfort or pain as possible, so I can spend as much fun time with you as possible. If it changes, I'll let you know.
Yeah, so I think what you're advocating for is that open discussion, because I remember a section in the book that really struck me, which is, the worst thing is for a child to hear from someone else, right? That it's always better coming from you, because you can control that messaging and in a way that because your child. Again, goes back to that common theme that your child the best, and so you would know. There's a question here about teens. So going back to, again, we're still going down the development theme and saying, well, communication with a younger child is going to be different than a teenager, and so our there's something you had said to me, which was kind of interesting, which is it said there are different types of kids that often parents worry about, And one of them is like this silent kid. And I'm thinking about a teenager who just says everything's okay. And you had mentioned that there's some things you can do to get your teenager who doesn't talk to talk, right?
Yeah. So one of them is to remind your teenager that the reason you're talking to him or talking to her is because you don't want them to worry alone. And it's really hard to tell. I will often have suggested parents that they say to their children, I'm going to either worry about you or worry with you. If you share with me what you're thinking, we can problem solve together. We would worry with each other and solve problems around it. If you don't tell me, I'm going to worry about you, and I'm going to be way more annoying if I'm worrying about you because I'm going to be not on target a lot of the time. So by sharing more, then those conversations are more on point. And sometimes asking a child, how would I know if you were having a hard time with this? Or do you know anybody else who has a parent with cancer? Do you worry about that child? How would their parents know? There's a book by Mark and Maya Silver that is a book for teenagers. It's lots of teenage voices in the book. And that might be an example of picking up that book. My parent has cancer and it sucks, I think is the title of the book. And reading something and wondering with the child, does this make sense? So sometimes it's easier for a teenager to talk about somebody else, and then they may back into sharing a bit more about themselves. But finding a way to make it a little easier to talk together is always the goal.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is like open communication, but co-processing, right? I think that's important, that you're working through some of these issues and you're modeling that you're thinking about it too. And is it okay not to have the answer, I guess, is the other thing that often comes up.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a wonderful modeling to say, let me be sure I really understand your question. What got you wondering about that? And let's figure out, here's who I think would be the best person for me to go to. Or, I want to talk to another parent or somebody in the medical team. I want to think about this because a good question deserves a good answer. And slowing it down, communication often goes deeper, not by quickly answering a question, but actually taking the time to understand the question and thinking out loud. Even as adults, we are helped to understand maybe what the question behind the question is for us by talking out loud with somebody, that co-processing piece. It's not just the information, it's dealing with the information. And on top of that, if it's not being explicitly talked about, then kids will imagine, depending on a parent's mood, that they know what's happening. And it may really be, it may be way off the mark. It's also a piece of emotional education to say to a child, my moods are going to go up and down with this, even with the cancer not changing at all. With no change in my melanoma, I'm going to have good days and bad days. I might have good hours and bad hours. So if I'm having a bad hour, you see me kind of teary, ask me if you want, but don't assume it's because anything's gotten worse. I don't like being, I don't like having a melanoma. So there are times when I'm going to be upset about that. Other times when it will be in the background, I won't be thinking about it. And frankly, there are lots of other things to be troubled about in the world that we live in. And we want to be sure that kids get that every mood that crosses a parent's face, we talk about them as waves, that emotions come in waves. You have to learn to ride the waves, but don't assume that all the waves have to do with a parent's cancer.
That's really great advice.
And it goes in both directions. It goes in both directions because often parents are seeing those waves and assuming it's their cancer, and kids will say to us, it's not what I keep telling my parent, it's not what I'm worried about. I really am worried about who am I going to go to the prom with, or I really am worried about, who's going to get this part in the play. It really isn't about the cancer. So in both sides, recognizing that the waves are coming, but you need to talk together to find out where the waves are coming from.
Right, and being curious is how you find out like where the emotions are coming from and how to ride that wave together. That's
absolutely.
That's great. I wanted to spend just a minute talking about two things that you've mentioned to me, is like how do we build regular rituals and habits, because there's a lot of disruption going on, and how do we build the community? And you mentioned two things. I want you to talk a little bit about the Minister of Information and the Captain of Kindness. I really love those two people.
Yeah. So not only do we need to process together, parent and child, but your community wants to process, will need to process with you. So it can be great to use a website to organize people to do the kinds of helping things that they might like to do. But it's also really nice to have somebody who's the point person. We call that person the Captain of Kindnesses. And that's the person that your neighbor, somebody from the school environment, somebody from church talks to. And they can process with that person that they're upset that you're facing this diagnosis and treatment. And it kind of protects you from every person's new processing and distress. Lets you save your energy for your own family and not processing it with everybody. So, and also if you don't have a captain of kindness and people want to do something helpful, often they do stuff that's actually not helpful. And it's sometimes easier for your good friend or your sister to say, yeah, you know what? Another casserole, not so helpful, thanks. But what would be really great would be this. So that's the captain of kindness. And then the Minister of Information is just remembering that it can take a lot of time and a lot of energy to share your news with people. Things that you put on the web, you have to assume that at some point your child may see, that other people who respond to what you put on the web may be seen by your child or their child. And again, when we're trying to facilitate kids getting their information from their parents, not from other people, we don't want someone else's child to read something online and bring that to your child at school or on social media. So being more intentional about Minister of Information and controlling the information that goes out so that either some well-meaning person in your community doesn't decide what everybody needs to know about you, and that you're not using a ton of energy to talk to every person who wants to hear it from you. And I'll just say, elementary school kids very clearly will report that when grown-ups talk to grown-ups outside of the family, they put on their game face. And then when they get off the phone or they step away from the door where someone's dropped something off, there's sort of a drop in their energy level. And elementary school kids will say, essentially, everybody else gets the best of my parent. And at home, my parent doesn't have that energy. They're happier talking to other grown-ups. They don't like spending time with me. And that's how they read that energy piece. We have a phone voice. We have a outward-facing voice. So just be a little mindful of that too. You want your kids to feel like they matter most.
Right. I know our time's coming to an end, but I'm really getting to hearing that theme of like open communication, co-processing, understanding your child's development, and your child, and sort of following along with that, finding special moments, building rituals, and building that community. Those are all so many things to unpack, and I can't believe we were able to cover some of those things in just 30 minutes. So thank you so much for your time. I'm so grateful for the work you do every single day to help our communities communicate with each other and help our families get stronger. So thank you. I'm so grateful for your time today. For our audience, come join us in April. Our guest is going to be Claire Castleman, a social worker at the University of Michigan, talking about anxiety. And I'm already getting anxious just saying anxiety. But thanks everyone for coming today, and looking forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you so much, Dr. Rauch. Really appreciate your time today.
Good night.
Good night.